Hello, my name is Amy Rofail, and this is your Friday, October 30 Red Alert for the Jerusalem Connection Report. Over the past month and a half, since the high holy days in Israel and on the Jewish calendar, there has been a severe uptick in violence and a call to action by the Palestinian leadership to take up arms against Jews, particularly Israeli citizens of any age or gender, from young children to people standing at a bus stop to the elderly walking home from a shop. Now, the Jewish people have indeed been suffering these kinds of events for millennia, but now in a day of 24-hour news cycles, cell phone videos, and the like, we can see more than ever the documentation of these actions. This outright hatred towards Jewish people under a variety of recent ruthless allegations, such as occupation of the land, oppression, the false apartheid state accusation, and of course most recently the false rumor that the Israeli government plans to take over the Dome of the Rock, which Benjamin Netanyahu repeatedly publicly has said this is not the case. The status quo is to remain in place. Needless to say, the news about what is really going on is trickling very slowly into the Western mainstream media. There are certainly some outlets that are more objective on the issue than others, but one of the common issues that come up is the idea of proportionality, or that the Israelis are taking a disproportionate reaction to the youth who are wielding knives and stones to hurt Israeli citizens. And I want to discuss this for a moment because it reveals a bias, at the very least a bias, and at the very worst, a significant anti-Semitism that runs through the news media, even in the West. Now, for example, if in New York City or on the streets of London there was any kind of social media push to have random people who believed in a certain cause take up rocks and stones and knives and just simply go out and attack whomever they've identified as the perpetrator of their allegations, regardless of age or gender, the law enforcement agencies of New York City or London or whatever Western city we are speaking of would certainly be on alert and take every measure to combat such issues. And at no point would anyone tell the law enforcement agencies to stand down or mitigate the violence on the street or think twice about how they're reacting. The norm in law enforcement and in self-defense law is that if you are perceiving bodily harm or death of your own self or someone in your care or someone you can protect, the use of lethal force or force that will neutralize the situation is indeed valid, reasonable, and of course legal. So it's interesting that the Obama administration and other news agencies seem to call out that the Israelis are taking a disproportionate response to neutralizing threats on the streets of Jerusalem and other communities. If someone's coming at you with a rock or a knife and you perceive great bodily harm or death, and you happen to have a gun that you are legally issued and trained to use, as law enforcement would be, then indeed that's the weapon you would probably use to protect yourself or whoever you are with, your family or people in your care if you are a professional. So why then is there this call, particularly to the Jewish people in Israel and the Israeli law enforcement, to somehow be the ones to de-escalate the violence and to stand down or take a step back and try to see what's going on from the other point of view? In no self-defense law or in law enforcement training manual is that the case for any Western nation that I'm aware of. So it really does ask the question, why then are the Israelis supposed to be held to a different standard when all they're trying to do is protect innocent citizens? So what you hear on the news are numbers issued such as 30 Palestinian killed, only 6 Israelis killed. Of course, that doesn't mention the many that are in the hospital because maybe their stab wounds weren't lethal. But the fact of the matter is if you are an officer of any kind and you have a weapon that you are trained in and issued to use to protect yourself and your fellow citizens, you will use it to neutralize a threat. And this is perfectly valid and perfectly reasonable anywhere in the world, except, of course, according to our administration in the U.S. and other outlets, that somehow this doesn't apply to the Israelis. So this is where I want you to focus on the notion of anti-Semitism when you hear the news or watch it. In a recent ABC News article, right on their homepage, the first line was, Israeli Defense Forces storm the Dome of the Rock and clear the place out. But in that article, I saw no context of why they went in there to begin with. The article read as if the IDF forces just had a whim to go in and storm the place and clear it out, which clearly wasn't the case. There was a threat, there was a skirmish. Jewish people are allowed to visit that site, and they were being stopped from doing so or bodily harassed while they did. It wasn't until the fourth or fifth paragraph down in that same article where they discussed a joint Palestinian-Israeli law enforcement patrol who were out together with the mission of keeping the peace and watching for threats from either side, that the Palestinian officer actually took out his arm and fired upon and killed an Israeli soldier, his counterpart, his compatriot at the moment, as they were on a joint mission. So clearly, this didn't even make the first paragraph of this particular news article, and I didn't even see it in any other venue. But the fact of the matter is, if a news media outlet can spin a story to make it seem as if an unprovoked aggressor of an Israeli law enforcement arm is just randomly shooting down Palestinian young men or randomly attacking or storming places of worship without the context of what the probable cause was, then it is skewing the truth. And it is presenting to the public an irrational and illogical perspective of the Jewish people. It makes them seem like bullies, which is actually not the case. And when a Palestinian who is trained for the use of force and to use his weapons to protect the citizenry turns around and uses that weapon on his compatriots, on his fellow law enforcement agents, then of course that's a big problem, and it reveals the motivation or the deep-seated anti-Semitism or Jew-hating that is going on in the Palestinian territories, and why the Israelis are constantly on alert when they're walking the streets. They do not know who could simply start attacking and with what weapon. Nobody can live like that. No reasonable country or city or community would accept that form of day-to-day life where anybody off the street might just come and attack you and hurt you. So what I want you to be aware of was when you watch the news agencies and you hear the debates from both sides, be watching the motivations and be seeking the truth. If an Israeli soldier did open fire, what was the context? What was the probable cause? What was the issue? And absolutely the case could be that it was unjustified or non-proportional. But I would guess that these are very rare, few and far between, and that the majority of the law enforcement actions are justified and legal and reasonable. These are things to think about as you watch the news, as we continue to look at the anti-Semitic actions that happen around the world, and in particular in Jerusalem this very day and time. Shabbat Shalom.